professor of psychology at the College of Worcester in Ohio. She received a PhD from Yale University in social psychology. Dr. Clayton's research examines people's relationships with the natural environment. Right. How it is constructed and how climate change affects mental health and well-being. She's the co-author of the widely used climate change anxiety scale, as well as the environmental identity scale, both of which have been used and validated in countries around the world. She is the author or editor of 6 books, including Identity and the Natural Environment, Conservation Psychology, Psychology and Climate Change, and is currently the editor of the Cambridge Element series in Applied Social Psychology, a fellow of the American Psychological Association and International Association of Applied Psychology. She's on the editorial boards for the Journal of Environmental Psychology, Environmental Research, Health, and One Earth, and was the lead author of the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Her current research focuses on impacts of climate change on mental health, as well as on future planning. She also hopes to promote positive vision for the future that emphasizes the interdependence between humans and nature. Thank you so much, Prof. Clayton, for being here with us tonight, and you may go ahead.
Thank you so much, Fatima, for that nice introduction and for the invitation to present. And thanks to all of you who are taking time from your evening to be here. Yes, I am actually currently in French Polynesia, where I'm talking to a group of scientists and artists about how to communicate the need to conserve coral reefs in the face of the threats they face. But it's a pleasure. So I very much appreciate your flexibility. What I want to do is sort of give you an overview of what I think of as the role of psychology in the climate crisis. So to start with something that you all know, climate change is a big problem that has to concern psychologists. And this is just a quote from the UN chief: "Humanity has opened the gates to hell. In the US, we've experienced a lot of wildfires, as have people in many other countries." It's a good image of how stark the problem we're facing is, and anything like that is going to be relevant to psychologists who are concerned with human well-being. So what is it that psychology can do? I divide this into 3 different things. One is to explore the ways in which people understand climate change and perceive the risks, because clearly this is a problem at some level that many people do not give sufficient weight to the concern about and the need to address climate change. Psychologists can also look at the human consequences, and this is a more recent area of research to fully understand the impacts of climate change on psychological well-being. And thirdly, and importantly, to encourage healthy responses. And psychologists, of course, are students of human behavior and have long attempted to encourage more healthy behavior. And I think that is very relevant when it comes to climate change. So explore each of these separately. First, in terms of investigating human understandings, why is it that people have such a hard time comprehending the gravity of the situation presented by climate change? I think that there are 4 main reasons. Again, I'll go over each of these one at a time, but one is that our cognitive capacities, while very, very impressive, are not infinite. There are limits to our cognitive abilities. A second is, of course, that we have many emotional defenses and we want to defend ourselves against negative emotions. A third is our social roles and social identities and how they construct our understanding of the world. And fourth is these ideologies or worldviews that we may have learned that also affect, sort of impose a framework on our understanding of what's happening. When we think of the cognitive barriers, one of the fundamental ones is ignorance. People do not know very much about how the climate works. They don't get clear information. This is not just stupidity, despite the sign. The climate system is very complex, and even climate scientists can't tell you everything about what exactly the effects will be and when they'll happen and who they'll affect and so on. So not knowing, and even if we know there's uncertainty about those effects and where they'll hit us, where and when, and psychological distance are feeling for many people that climate change, while it is a problem, is a distant problem. It's either distant geographically, that it will affect people far away from us, maybe distant temporally, that it's going to have an impact, but it won't have an impact for the 10 or 20 years. Or it's distant essentially in its importance to us because we personally might not expect to be affected, and we have other things on our minds. So all of these are sort of filtering the information we have access to about climate change. The emotional barriers, certainly psychologists know a lot about this. One is just not sufficiently strong emotional response, so apathy, feeling that, well, yes, it's a problem, but someone else will deal with it. I don't really want to devote my emotional resources to that. On the alternative is essentially too strong an emotional response, when you might feel such overpowering fear about climate change that you're motivated to protect yourself by denying it. And that too is obviously a very common reaction. And then reactance is a different kind of emotional barrier, but that feeling that we don't like to be told what to do. It's like a 3-year-old child who you tell to do something and immediately refuse, even if it's something they wanted to do to begin with. We don't want to give up control of our own lives to someone else, so we try to regain control by saying, no, I'm going to continue to burn carbon or whatever. The social barriers are particularly strong in my society in the US, but I think you can see them almost everywhere, that there are groups that are associated with caring for the environment and groups that are associated with not caring for the environment. So stereotypes about who cares. Some of the stereotypes, certainly in the US, are that people on the political left care and people on the political right don't care. There's also a sense that women care more about environmental issues. Some of these stereotypes are very specific, locally specific. Some of them are more generalizable. Once you have people essentially located in groups according to those positions on climate change, then you have group polarization where they pull farther apart. And definitely you've seen that with the political parties in the United States, that 50 years ago, there was actually quite a lot of agreement. Many pro-environmental laws were passed by Republicans. There was shared understanding that this is an important issue. But as the groups became more associated with different positions, they felt the need to pull further and further apart. I will say, especially the Republicans, to the extent that while Democrats' acceptance of climate change has increased in the past few years, Republicans has actually decreased, and despite the increasing evidence. Also relevant to these group identities is mistrust of communicators. So you might be listening to a message about climate change, but you don't trust the person who is giving you that message. And this mistrust is a general problem in society that manifests itself in all kinds of areas. Climate change is one of them. And finally, I want to emphasize collective ignorance because this is something we can do something about. There's a phenomenon where everybody might be concerned about an issue, but they don't think anybody else is concerned. We are ignorant about the problem. So a person might think to themselves, I care, but none of my neighbors seem to be very worried. None of my elected officials seem to be very worried. So I must be unusual. And it turns out that everybody else is thinking the same thing. So we underestimate the extent to which there's actually quite a lot of agreement about this. And the ideological barriers have to do with our belief systems. For some people, especially in the US, perhaps it's a belief in capitalism, a certain economic organization that says if you have free enterprise, that will solve the problem, and you shouldn't have governmental controls. So that very strong belief in capitalism prevents you from considering possible ways for the government to deal with climate change. Another common belief is a belief in technology. I see this quite frequently. People say, well, somebody will invent something that will save us. I even heard political officials say technology, AI will save us from climate change. Okay, maybe. It seems like dangerous to rely on it, though. And for some people, their religious beliefs interfere with their willingness to accept climate change. So there are some, for example, fundamentalist Christian sects that um, have this sense that only God can affect the earth. It's impossible to think that humans could affect the earth. It's almost sacrilegious. So to acknowledge climate change is essentially to doubt God, and you can see how that would be a very challenging position to hold. So given all of these kinds of barriers about getting people to accept the information and acknowledge the information about climate change, there's been quite a lot of research on effective communication strategies, which I won't even attempt to try and go over, but a few points. One is that people sometimes do need the information, especially they need information about what you want them to do. So it's not enough to tell people climate change is a problem. You have to say climate change is a problem, therefore you should vote for this policy, or you should try to reduce your fossil fuel emissions, or you should talk to your neighbors about how to prepare for droughts and floods. So give them information about what they can do, make it relevant to them. Also make it somewhat positive so that you don't have this denial. If you just tell people everything's terrible, everything's very scary, uh, that will elicit this sort of refusal to talk about it. If you give them some positive, we can make a better future, we can fix this if we do the following, or at least we can improve things if we do the following, then they're more likely to listen. And don't try to go directly against somebody's core identity. So you certainly wouldn't want to say your religious beliefs are stupid, ignore them. You have to say, no, if you're a Christian, for example, think about the emphasis on stewardship and how people should care for their environment. Um, so let people hold on to their core beliefs while also responding to climate change. And Ed Maybach, who is the director or was the director of the George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication, put it this way, and I think this is very useful, to remember that there's 5 things you want to convey to people. Climate change is real, so let's not pretend it's not real. It is. It's us, that is, it's human caused. Scientists agree, because often people think that there's a lot of scientific disagreement, and there just isn't. It's bad. We shouldn't sugarcoat the fact that climate change has negative impacts, but also there's hope. Those are the 5 key aspects of the message about climate change that I think we want to convey. Now, having just said that people don't care enough about climate change, I do want to emphasize that people are worried. And this is getting at that issue of collective ignorance, that many people think that, oh, nobody else is as worried as I am, or hardly anybody else is as worried. No, the majority of people are worried. And this is a study that I participated in about 4 years ago that was able to survey 10,000 young people. We picked 10 countries around the world, trying to get very different kinds of countries, small island states, developed Western states, northern, southern, etc. And across all of the countries, more than 80%, I think about 84%, said they were at least moderately worried. So you see, only 5% of people said they were not worried at all. And 45% said that it was beginning to affect the way they lived their lives, that their concerns about climate change, their worry itself, was beginning to affect their lives. So when you talk to people about climate change, or when you think about it, you can feel confident that, yes, most people are worried. And here's a more recent study that just looked at US participants. And this will probably be less meaningful since you don't know about um, the state differences in the US. But even in the US, where you have quite a lot of controversy about climate change, you have, in most states, only 5% of people or less who say they are not at all worried, and definitely over 80% saying at least moderately worried. So it is a big concern for people. Why is it a concern? It's a concern, well, it should be a concern for many reasons, but one important reason for all of us is the human consequences of climate change. And I think 10 years ago, at least among the people I talked to, a lot of us were not that aware of the human consequences. We talked a lot about polar bears and how they might go extinct, um, and melting glaciers, but there wasn't a sense of the direct human impacts as much. In recent years, we've seen much more evidence of the droughts, the wildfires, the major storms, and so on. So the human consequences are becoming more apparent. And how does climate change have these consequences? I divide this into four categories. The acute events, so the things that have an onset and a duration, like storms, wildfires, and floods. The changes that are more chronic, so gradual increases in temperature, rising sea levels, loss of biodiversity, impaired air quality is something that's very important. Then there are the indirect impacts, people who are being displaced because of climate change, people whose physical health is impaired or threatened, people who are losing their jobs or who are finding it harder to make a living because of climate change. And then perhaps one of the most psychological categories, this perceptual category, that people who are just worried and feel this existential anxiety about an uncertain future. We have very, very good evidence that acute weather events have a harmful human impact. So you have to think about climate change to know that to have data for decades that extreme weather events um, have a big impact. In recent years, they displace about 20 million people a year worldwide. 500,000 have been killed by climate-related events. So not just any disaster, but disasters that are associated with climate change. In America, 1/3 of people say they've personally been affected by an extreme weather event. Often that's a heat wave, or it could be, again, a major storm or wildfire. And a vast majority of American counties have experienced some sort of climate disaster in recent years. And we have evidence that after these kinds of extreme events, mental health problems increase. We see increases in rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, suicide, misuse of substances like drugs and alcohol. People have more sleep problems. There's also more interpersonal violence. And a study I like to describe because it's one of the most thorough. It's a fairly recent study. The first one I see with this kind of data looked at over 7 million people who had been exposed to wildfires in California. So these were multiple wildfires over multiple years, and found significantly increased use of antipsychotic uh, medications and mood stabilizing medications, but not in other kinds of medications. So it was specifically the medications associated with depression, anxiety, that were increasing after the extreme event, after the wildfire. And these impacts can last. Again, lots of evidence. Just as, here's an example. There was a big fire in 2016 in Alberta, Canada, um, leading to increased rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and generally mental health problems, more than the baseline level of those problems. And oh yes, and that was 1 year after the wildfire. I do want to emphasize that the impacts of these extreme events vary quite a lot. Certainly, there's how much exposure and how much harm you experience. So even within the same, on the same street, some houses might be destroyed, some might be saved, some might experience a little bit of damage. Um, Also, prior exposure, so repeated exposure to trauma tends to sensitize people and make them more vulnerable. Also, very importantly, and it's important because this tells us how we might want to prepare for these kinds of events. What kind of resources are available to people after the event? Certainly, if you have money, it's easier for you to recover. It's easier for you to rebuild your house or move to someplace else. Social resources are also important. Do you have a community that will help you? Do you have access to food, water, and shelter? Do you have access to healthcare? So these access to practical resources will also determine the mental health impacts. I want to say just a little bit about chronic changes because, again, fairly recently this wasn't being talked about as much, but now we know that these have a strong association with mental health. There's been a lot of research on the impacts of higher temperatures and very good data, global data. Higher temperatures are associated with increases in suicide, psychiatric hospitalizations, and aggression, decreases in happiness, and impacts in general on physical and mental functioning. And there's been, certainly I've seen a lot of discussion about this in the popular press with the very hot summers we've been having. How does this affect school children who may not have air conditioning? How does this affect agricultural laborers or anyone who works outside? The idea that you have to get up earlier to do the work before it gets very hot. Air pollution is also very clearly associated with threats to mental health and cognitive functioning. And again, some of these effects are immediate, but some of them can be long lasting. So, an exposure to air pollution as a child may have, to high levels of air pollution as a child, may have impacts on your mental health as an adult. And again, all of these health impacts depend on the interaction of a number of factors. So I've been talking mostly about the impacts, but then there are the things that make you vulnerable. And then there are the things that provide you support. And it's the interaction of all of those things that will lead to the overall effect on mental health. It's really important, and I suspect many of you are aware of this, to highlight the inequity in impacts of climate change and the existing inequity and increasing inequity. So certainly some groups are more vulnerable geographically because they are located in parts of the world that are more affected by climate change. Temperatures are going up more rapidly in some parts of the world, and I believe South Africa is one. Obviously, if you're in a low-lying island or a coastal area, you're more vulnerable to rising sea levels. If you are living in a place that's very cold, you're more vulnerable perhaps to thawing permafrost. Then some people are more physiologically vulnerable. For example, we know the elderly are particularly vulnerable to heat. People already suffering from mental illness are more vulnerable because a lot of psychoactive medications interfere with your ability to regulate your own body temperature. Mental illness may also impact your ability to care for yourself, to recognize that you need to go inside when it's really hot, for example. And people with other disabilities are often left out of evacuation plans um, or, uh, or planning for climate change. There are social vulnerabilities, people who are they don't have access to information, they don't have access to resources. There's economic vulnerability. So we know that people who are poor tend to be more exposed to environmental hazards. They live in areas that are more vulnerable. They have lower quality housing that provides less protection from heat or extreme weather. They have less access to green space, which is good for us, both physical and mental health. And I particularly want to highlight women and children, not because they are the same, but because they both they have different sort of physiology, especially pregnant women, compared to uh, adult men. And they have different roles, which give them different access to power and resources. So children, because they're still developing, are very vulnerable to having that development thrown off track by exposure to extreme events or bad climate conditions. Women, when they're pregnant, certainly we know that extreme weather events and high temperatures are associated with preterm birth, which is unhealthy for the woman and for the child. And again, often in many countries, they don't have access to the information, they don't have access to the resources, they may not be allowed to drive. I was reading just recently about Afghanistan. I think the recent earthquake, women were not being helped by men because there's such a strong prohibition about you're not supposed to touch a woman you're not related to. So women who had been trapped by the rubble and the earthquake, men would just walk by them. And I've heard of similar things in response to flooding, that women who are, again, trying to cross, for example, a flooded road, a man might be willing to help them get out of the water. Indigenous peoples are very vulnerable to climate change because so much of their culture is connected to the environment that when the environment starts to change, it may weaken the social networks. The traditional rituals, the traditional foods, the generational knowledge that's passed down. And some research has suggested they show increased levels of conflict and substance abuse associated with climate change, at least in some areas. However, Indigenous peoples also have often experienced displacement in the past, and they have adapted to changing conditions, and they may have lessons of how to kind of be aware of their environments and adapt to those changing conditions that would be helpful for non-Indigenous populations. And farmers. Farmers are so exposed to climatic conditions. We know that farming is one of the occupations that has the highest suicide rates, and drought has been shown to lead to increased levels of mental distress and suicide among farmers, not just in the US, but around the world. I also have to highlight the indirect impacts. They're harder to study because it's harder to identify climate change perhaps as the main driver, but we know that climate change displaces people. It forces them to migrate. We know that it has economic impacts. We know that it has impacts on their ability to find healthy, nutritious, sufficient food. And all of these things are associated. Of course, they're all bad in many ways, but they also have mental health implications. So migration is associated with threats to mental health. Partly it's of course, the there's something that drives you to migrate, and that's stressful. The migration process is stressful. And then when you get to the end place, that can be very stressful as well, because often there's resistance from the local inhabitants. They don't want the immigrants there. So immigrants and even second generation immigrants do show increased rates of mental health problems. We know that economic insecurity is associated with mental health problems. Poor people tend to have more depression and anxiety than rich people. Losing income increases the incidence of depression and anxiety. And experiencing poverty as a child makes you more likely to have not achieved your full cognitive capabilities as an adult, and also more likely to have mental illness as an adult. Food insecurity also associated with worse mental health, even putting aside the economic economic issues are very strongly associated. But if you set aside poverty, food insecurities is also associated with worse mental health. Food insecurity among children can have lifelong effects. and it's related to lower positive well-being and lower life satisfaction. But I wanted to talk about the sort of last category, this impact and what people thinking about climate change. And here are recent headlines from U.S. newspapers. When I say recent, within the past year, really. Earth passed a critical climate change threshold, where climate change is supercharging disasters. Climate change is speeding toward catastrophe. These are very, very alarming headlines, almost, you might say, apocalyptic. And so, of course, people are scared. And here's just one quote from a Brazilian student who said, "I'm really scared for the future. I cry a lot. I don't know how my future will be, not only my future, but the future of planet Earth. And I wish I could know what's going to happen." And it makes you anxious. Of course, it makes you anxious to think that the entire future of your planet is at risk and you don't know what's going to happen. So this anxiety is growing. And some of the quotes I have heard over the years from climate activists mostly are here. "My feelings had a physical manifestation. I stopped eating properly. I would get to the stage where I would freeze." Those of you who are therapists who do clinical sorts of work might think, "Oh, that sounds like a problematic level of anxiety. That sounds like a really clinical issue." And so this is what my colleague Brian Garcia and I decided we wanted to assess. There's clearly climate anxiety. Is it a mental health problem? And we developed this scale of climate change anxiety with two subscales. One has to do with how your concerns are affecting your cognitions and emotions. The other one has to do with how it's affecting your behavior. These are correlated subscales, but they also sometimes show different patterns of associations. And climate anxiety is not necessarily a mental health problem, but it becomes one when it starts to impair you, when it starts to be associated with that functional impairment. And here's one study that shows, looking at climate anxiety around the world, what were the correlations with well-being. And essentially, these are all negative correlations. You can see in every case except for one, the confidence intervals are low, 0. So we know that we can feel fairly confident that there's a negative association between climate anxiety and well-being. And many studies have found that it's associated with clinical measures of anxiety and depression. And I think this is really important to study because well, for many reasons, but one reason is that thinking about these climate change worries may affect behavior, especially among young people, because they need to make decisions about their future. And in a recent survey, we found that more than 2/3 of US youth said climate change will influence where I choose to live. A majority is saying this is influencing my plans for the future. I'm questioning whether it's worth putting work into my education. I'm questioning whether I should put the work into my career. They're thinking about how it should affect their decision to have children. So this is an issue. Climate change anxiety and mental health responses to climate change are clearly having an impact, not just on mental health, but also on decision-making behavior. So I think the last job of psychologists is to try to encourage healthy responses in the face of climate change. These negative effects are not not inevitable. I think that's a really important message. And one thing we can and should try to do is mitigate the extent of climate change. Stop at this point, but we can reduce the extent of climate change at every additional tenth of a point of tenth of a degree of warming will make it will be worthwhile. So psychologists can use their behavior change techniques to develop evidence-based interventions, as well as communicating to people about the risks to public health. We know that environmental protection involves human behavior, not just what individuals choose to do in their own households, in terms of what they eat, how they use energy, and so on, but also the behavioral norms they create within their communities and their support for public policies. Some of the external influences on behavior are prompts, feedback, incentives, targets, the physical and legal environment. There are ways to try to shape behavior, make it easier for people, remind people that they should save energy, reward them for saving energy, make it easier for them to save energy. And it's often easier to change the environment than to try to change the person. So I think we should focus on these external factors before thinking, oh, we need to change attitudes. For example, plastic bags at supermarkets are a big problem in many places around the world. It's not that hard to just ban plastic bags and tell people to bring their own bag. And if you do that, people will bring their own bag. They may grumble a little bit at first, but that will make the difference. So you make the desirable behaviors easier, and the undesirable behaviors more difficult. But of course, our internal factors also affect our behavior. What do we know? What are our attitudes and values? What are the social norms? These are some of the things I talked about earlier. And one of the things we could do is strengthen these social norms. And this gets back to the idea that we have this collective ignorance about what other people think. And here's a survey. This is just in the US, but ask people, how important is taking action on global warming to your family and friends? And you can see that, not too far from 50%. So 44% said it's not at all important or not too important. But when we asked, sorry, I don't think this graph shows what I thought it did. I'm sorry, I think I chose the wrong graph here. Anyway, this particular survey did show that people felt that it was more important to them themselves than it was to their family and friends. Yet everybody thought it was more important to themselves, to their family and friends. So clearly they're wrong. It is important to others as well. And some of the ways in which we can address these social norms. So one thing that you see a lot is what's sometimes called greenwashing, this idea that behaviors are presented to people as if they will solve the climate crisis, and they're really irrelevant. So we need to try and cut down on that. But also this sort of collective silence. I think we need to do more to speak about climate change, to speak to other people, to share our feelings. We need to encourage people to be resilient in the face of the threats that are already here and will increase, and if possible, to adapt to them. And thinking about that effort, we need to consider not just individual mental health, but also collective well-being. And this is, I point this out because sometimes psychologists are criticized for focusing on the mental health of the individual, and people say, oh, but then you're ignoring the wider problem. You just want individuals to stop feeling anxious. I don't think that's true, and I don't think we should encourage that perspective. We need individuals to be mentally healthy, but also we need the society to be to have a strong well-being. And for both of those, we need to allow for hope. And people who do have hope, a constructive hope, are more likely to engage in pro-environmental behavior. When I say constructive hope, you can have a hope that, oh, somebody will fix things. I hope that somebody does something. I hope that the problem is exaggerated. Those are based in denial. Those are not useful. But if I say, I hope, I believe that it's possible that we will find a solution, that we will find positive adaptations, that's constructive hope. So here's the way it's been considered by people who talk about it. I'm willing to take actions. And if everyone works together, we can solve these problems. So if you feel those things and you don't feel that climate change is beyond your control, if you do feel that you have some control, that's the constructive hope. I think this hope is created and allowed in part by our social interactions. So people need to feel some level of self-efficacy, some ability, some perception that they can do something that will make a difference. And certainly that's partly an individual difference, but it's also associated with experiences, and it's enabled by social interactions in which we talk not just about things being hopeless, but about what I did, why I did it, why I personally have. So we need to have these kinds of responses, not just to individual mental health problems, but that address the attitudes at a societal level through our interpersonal interactions, just what we say to people, how we talk to them, um, through community programs that perhaps allow a space for people to come together and share ideas about, share their emotions about climate change, but also share ideas about how to adapt, how to be resilient to potential climate events. And also, we certainly need societal policies that protect our collective well-being. So to truly be resilient, we need social change, not individual change, or not just individual change. We need societies that acknowledge the problem. We need education in public schools that tell people about climate change and how to prepare for it. We need mental health care systems that are inclusive and supportive. And I don't think there's any country in the world that does enough for support mental health. And we need urban design that is resistant to the effects of climate change, more greenery, more surfaces that can absorb water in case of floods, and so on. And that is my last slide, so I'll stop, and I think we have time for some questions.
Thank you so much for that really amazing presentation. It was quite comprehensive and it covered so many different areas that I had questions and then you answered those questions. So yeah, thank you so much for that. This is a safe space, so anybody that would like to switch on the camera and video, please do so. We'd like to engage with you and hear your perspectives, and you may ask the presenter questions. She has agreed to answer those questions, so you can go ahead.
Yes, and I do see one question in the chat asking about the extent to which a sense of climate injustice influences people's actions. And I think it depends on, are you aware of injustice generally? Are you aware of injustice that affects you? I think for people, this is somewhat anecdotal, but awareness of injustice can lead to anger, and anger is a very powerful motivating emotion. And I've certainly heard this from climate activists from the global south, that they feel very strongly energized to start doing something about climate change because of their awareness of how unfair it is that they did nothing to, or next to nothing to contribute to the problem, and are experiencing worse impacts. So I think that there's certainly a possibility of a positive impact of that awareness of injustice. And that's one reason I try to stress it, because in my earlier, I really I studied perceptions of justice a lot, and people do care about how fair things are for the most part. People are more likely to support climate policies if they think those policies are fair, and it's not just about self-interest. So I think highlighting this, the degree of injustice, hopefully will be a motivating factor.
Okay. And then we have, thank you for the packed presentation. I would like to ask, in the context of psychology, is there a way we can characterize and address the hesitancy and slowness of policymakers in taking firm and binding measures to mitigate climate change and allocate the necessary resources and efforts towards adaptation? Thank you for that question.
Yes, it's a wonderful question, and it's one that I think about a lot myself, because obviously my own policymakers are very bad in terms of addressing climate change right now. I think political processes are complex, and I don't claim to be an expert, but I think one major factor is they are really encouraged to think in the short term, not the long term. And so if climate change is often planning for the future, and people are reluctant to make sacrifices now to protect, to have future benefits. If you're a policymaker and you know you're up for re-election in 2 years, you have very little incentive to do something that won't have a positive impact for 5 or 10 years. You need to convince people that you're doing something now, and what you're doing now is not increasing taxes on fossil fuels. It's not making their lives more difficult, and so on. But also, I think in politics, the loudest voices are not necessarily the majority, but the loudest voices have a disproportionate impact. So yes, there's a lot that could be said there, but I'll stop that.
Okay. Right. Short-termism in the political space is quite the reality. Thank you for that. Was the comment by Patrick. Thank you, Patrick, for that really lovely comment. If there's any other questions? So, Prof, you mentioned that climate activists are really impacted by climate change, and they are negatively affected by this particular experience. So, do you have any recommendations for developing interventions for people that are climate activists? Do you have any thoughts on that matter?
I think that's a great question, and one that really needs more research is what are the long-term effects of being a climate activist, and how to maintain your motivation and not experience, burnout and negative emotions and so on. We do need more research, so I can't give a comprehensive answer, but I think one thing is certainly, and one advantage of being a climate activist is the social support. So finding a group of other people that you're working with not only increases your own sense of efficacy, but actually it's just a positive experience to be with other people who are working together. And so you might share some laughs and have fun, have those positive emotions, and that can be a real source of support. And then, which I already sort of made reference to, is trying to increase your sense of efficacy by getting involved, thinking about what you can do and doing that thing. But I will also say that people need to give themselves time off. They need to allow themselves to step back. And I think this is a problem for climate activists sometimes, is that they feel so personally responsible that they can't stop for a day or the entire fight will be lost. And I think bearing in mind that the responsibility is collective, it's not individual, that you can't do your best if you're undermining your own health, and that includes mental health. So giving yourself permission to engage to take care of yourself, I think, is important.
Okay, thank you so much for that. That's really useful. Prof Bonds, your hand is up.
Thank you very much. I wonder, Prof Clayton, if you have any advice on an ideal sort of training program for psychologists, especially in the global south. As you know, environmental psychology and climate psychology more specifically is still very underrepresented in the training of psychologists. So if you've got any thoughts, ideas on how we could, inform the next generation of psychologists coming through.
Yes, absolutely. I really think that this is something psychologists can and should do, is to incorporate some training on this into routine education. And I know there are some groups talking about this. I believe the American Psychological Association is, maybe the Society for, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but some psychological societies are thinking about developing educational materials for psychologists. And I think, which would just include, here's some of the evidence about impacts of climate change on mental health, because I think a lot of people don't know this. So to recognize that it's relevant, and then talk about what's sometimes described climate-aware therapies. It's also been recommended that clinicians and therapists need to kind of monitor their own emotional response, because maybe your own unwillingness to talk about climate change could get in the way of helping your patient to deal with it. But I have seen some studies that have surveyed, small groups of therapists, and one recent one in Germany found that a lot of the therapists reported that their clients were talking to them about their climate change concerns. So I do think better preparation as part of psychological training is very appropriate.
Okay, then we have a question or comment and a thought in the chat box by Stephen. Thank you, Stephen, for this. Prof, thank you for the great presentation. What really concerns me is the impact on youth. I can see the anxiety in my own children. Are there examples of group programs for the youth to help manage their collective existential anxiety?
I'm not aware of group programs for youth, but I do know that I've sort of seen research about educational settings, and I think this is this has a lot of potential to help our youth if we talk about climate change more in public schools, because that's where almost all the children are going to be exposed to that setting, so it's accessible to all of them. Teachers say, for the most part, that children do want to talk about climate change. The children don't know, the teachers are sometimes a little uncertain as to how to deal with it. So they need a lot of help with that. But I think providing opportunities, and there has been some research that just shows that teachers who talk about the problem, but in a way that provides hope, so is important. And then I guess I will just add, a lot of young people talk about feeling shut down when they talk about their anxiety. So what we need to do is allow them, is respect their anxiety, give them the message, you're anxious because you care. That's a good thing. You're not stupid for being maybe here's a thing you could do with that anxiety. You can talk to other people, you can find ways to take action.
Okay, then we have a comment by Jennifer. Just a comment, Climate Psychology Alliance. And in North America, we have CPANA that offers programs and trainings for psychologists, for example, how to host a climate cafe. Lots of great resources shared through these networks. Thank you so much for that comment. And Prof. Mapuda, you have a question. Your hand is up.
Thank you, Ms. Peters. My question is, all the time thank you for a great presentation. My question is, or rather comment, is we often hear that policies and implementation takes time. And I'm wondering if there could be maybe a way to collectively speed up certain things, because we always are seeing the effects and the impact of climate change and mental health. I mean, so many things are going wrong and things are falling up with so many social determinants currently that we have. And I'm just wondering if there is maybe a way. I'm saying so because, in the government, we know if people want things to be done, like a radically change, you find that they will strike. But is there a way to speed up what we are seeing and, just speed up some of the policy implementation that will help to fast track, dissemination of, taking care and infusing climate change with mental health and all other aspects that are important that you have highlighted? Is there a way that we can fuel that or fast track any implementation of these policies, or fasten the processes rather?
Yes, thank you for that question. I wish I had a good answer, because even within very well-meaning organizations, you come up with a plan and then it takes years to make any progress on it. So it's very frustrating. I would say one recommendation is to avoid trying to do things perfectly. So you might think, well, we want to do this to address climate change, but if we do that, we're ignoring this other thing, so we have to take that into account. It could be something as simple as, oh, I want to set up a weekly meeting for people who are concerned, but oh, then they'll all have to drive here. Is that bad that they're all driving their cars and increasing their carbon emissions in order to attend the meeting? And I would just address one problem, allow yourself to address one problem at a time. I mean, clearly we don't want to do things that make things worse, but don't feel that you have to come up with the perfect solution before you can act. Just find something that seems like a step in the right direction and take action. And certainly to motivate myself, I have no illusion that most of the things I do will actually have an impact on carbon emissions, to put it very broadly, but at least by taking an action, I can demonstrate to other people that I care about taking the action, and maybe they will take the actions that will have more impact. So allow yourself to start small.
Thank you so much. I think that is a wonderful note to end off on, that there's hope, that we can do more together, and that we really do need to start somewhere, not try and be perfect. So I really love that message. Stephen has a last comment for us. Thanks, Prof. That was very helpful response. It seems like on this issue in the educational and therapeutic settings with youth, we need to affirm their concerns, valid, and assist them to deal with the anxiety constructively rather than becoming despondent about the future. I really like that comment as well, Stephen. And to everyone that is here tonight, thank you so much for your time, for your engagement, and to Prof Susan Clayton, we are really appreciative of your time. We really enjoyed listening to your presentation, and we hope to engage with you in the future.
Thank you, and good luck to all of you who are trying to work in this space in one way or another. All right. Bye.
Bye.